Great, thank you. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the custodians of the land on which we work, meet and live on. I'm joining you from the lands of the Jacqui people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I recognise the sovereignty of this land was never ceded. My name is Karina and I'm from the Relationships and Sexuality Education Project. For those of you who haven't met us before, our project provides support for WA school staff in delivering comprehensive and evidence-based relationships and sexuality education. We are generously supported by the WA Health Growing and Developing Healthy Relationships program and Curtin University, who helped us make this webinar possible today. We run a number of PD events throughout the year. We do have a 2-day teacher training and school staff workshop, and we also have a symposium coming up next year. So we will be sending through more information about that after this workshop. But for the next hour and a half, we are talking about ways to engage parents with relationships and sexuality education. And we have two very fabulous leaders in the RSE sector, Dr. Jacqui Hendriks and Dr. Tessa Opie joining us today. So a little bit about Jacqui. She's a senior lecturer, research fellow and the sexology course coordinator at Curtin University, and she's also the project manager of the RSE project. She's done extensive research in the areas of sexual health and sexuality, particularly across RSE in schools, and is passionate about ensuring all young people receive comprehensive, contemporary and engaging relationships and sexuality education from home, school and elsewhere. We are also joined by Dr. Tessa Opie, who is the founder and director of In Your Skin. Tessa is a keen advocate for healthy and consenting relationships, and she's had an extensive experience in education delivery and training facilitation, having worked as an educator across the government, not-for-profit and private sectors, and as a guest lecturer at various universities. She's also currently working as an expert consultant for several education departments, including the South Australian Department of Education. So there will be time for some Q&A after with Jacqui and Tess, but you're more than welcome to drop questions in the chat. We also encourage any attendees here today to please join us in sharing any of your success stories when it comes to engaging families. So please join me in welcoming our first guest speaker, Jacqui. Thank you.
Okay, so fingers crossed the tech works for me. Does that look right, Karina? Sweet. Okay. So welcome everybody. It's fabulous to have you all online. So thank you for taking this 90 minutes out of your day to come and listen to Tessa and myself. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently standing. I'm based on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of that community, past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Aboriginal peoples have for thousands of years been very strong in passing on information to their young people around all sorts of things, but also in the space of relationships and sexuality and health. So we definitely stand in their footsteps and take great guidance from them. I'm really excited to share this small little research project with you today. We're going to make all the slides available at the end for you, and we're actually in the process of tidying all of this data up and putting it into a really nice report for the WA Health Department, and that should be ready by the end of the month. So we're very happy to share that link or that PDF document with everybody who's registered today. So no need to make any copious notes or anything, and hopefully I won't bore you too much with statistics. I'm very excited to present this work on behalf of all of the named researchers on this first slide. So just a fabulous team of people that came to me with this idea, helped us to secure the money and helped to get it off the ground. It's been a really good success. So just some background for everybody. I know I'm preaching to the converted when we're talking about the benefits of school-based relationships and sexuality education. This is obviously a crowd I do not need to convince. But we have known in Australia for decades and internationally for decades how important RSE is and the protective benefits that come with it. But we know that on the ground, implementation is still incredibly ad hoc. And when we go to schools and we ask them why they're not delivering really comprehensive programs, parental backlash is really common. So that can be either a perception that parents are going to have an issue, but sometimes occasionally they are hearing some dissent from some vocal minorities, which is absolutely impacting what they choose to cover within school. So we know parents are really important, and there's been a lot of research done internationally where they've done surveys of parent populations, and every time they do these pieces of work, it's at least 80% nationwide support of parents in lots of different countries saying that we totally back schools to deliver RSE. And this is even in really conservative countries, so places like Bangladesh, Malaysia, Oman, Iran, really quite high levels of support. But we've never actually had a data set in Australia ourselves. So there's been a few little projects along the way. A few states and territories have done some things. We've had a few focus group type projects get off the ground. And there was one national survey that was actually done at the beginning of this year as well. But they only spoke to parents who had a child enrolled in a government school. And they specifically focused on how parents felt about diverse sexualities and diverse genders being taught in school. That's a really nice project as well. That got over 2,000 responses. But again, it was a much narrower focus than what we were trying to do here. So we just basically wanted to do the first ever national survey of Australian parents, but we wanted to be quite selective in the way, or quite open in the way that we recruited. We didn't want to just preach to the converted and attract people who either felt really for or against sex ed in schools. We wanted to basically have a relatively random sample of parents' approach to participate. So whilst we have this big national data set, what I'm presenting on today is the West Australian cohort, because we were lucky to get funding from the WA Health Department to do the national project. And so we promised them as part of that we would oversample in Western Australia so that we would have enough numbers of West Australian parents in order to be able to generate some West Australian data. So that's what I'm going to specifically talk to you about today. But I'm very happy to share any national comparisons along the way. But what's happening in Western Australia was pretty reflective of how parents nationally felt. So it was a cross-sectional survey, a whole bunch of items. We didn't create them from scratch. We went to a Canadian team who'd recently surveyed their parents, and we asked if we could use their instrument. We did make some minor amendments to some of the questions, but for the most part, we replicated their survey in full. We employed a market research company called the Online Research Unit, and they do lots of work for research groups all across the country. They have a proprietary panel of adults who are just people who like to complete surveys because they do get incentives. And it's about 300,000 people on their panel. So they sent the survey item or the survey instrument out to anyone on their panel that has identified that they are a parent of a child in either a primary or a secondary school, and that's how we got our survey sent to everyone. So nationally, it was just over 2,200 responses and 643 parents from WA. So that's just a quick snapshot. There was 4 sections in the survey. We asked some demographic stuff at the end, and at the beginning, we basically wanted to know, how supportive are you of delivery of sex ed in schools? And then the next section was actually a really comprehensive list of 40 different topics. And for every person who answered the survey, the order of those topics was randomly generated. So everyone got their order, got that list in a different order. And for each topic, the parents had to indicate whether or not they thought that should be covered by a school, and if so, what should be the first grade level. And we just asked a whole bunch of attitudinal statements, and there was this lovely little section where we allowed them to provide some open text responses as well. So demographically, we had more females than males, but not too bad. And the majority of our parents in Western Australia were sort of in that 35 to 44 year age bracket, which is probably quite typical of parents. And, you know, we did have a reasonable number coming from regional and remote areas of Western Australia. That's probably pretty close to the actual statewide spread of metro versus regional. Most of our respondents had a child that was currently in a government school, but we did have a significant number there who were in the independent system, or the Catholic system, and a really diverse mix of religious affiliations. And we also asked about their voting preferences as well. So I'm going to come back to both of those things in a minute. But just note over on the religion section, there was a significant number of parents who actually indicated that they were Catholic, so getting close to 20%. And I just want to highlight the Catholics because I'm going to come back to them. So just note that, pretty healthy proportion of parents identifying as Catholic, and also a significant proportion of parents who had a child in the Catholic system. So this is, the crux of it. What is that magic number? And I'm a positive person, so I'm going to round that 92.6% up to 93 and say it loud and proud. 93% of all parents in Western Australia are supportive of relationships and sexuality education in schools. So much higher than those other countries that I spoke about previously, where they would have somewhere between 80–85%. Nationally, our level of support was 90%. 89.9% technically. So Western Australia is a little bit more supportive. There was a little bit of difference across the country, but the statisticians tell me that it's not to a level, the difference between the different states and territories wasn't significant. So we won't put too much focus on that. So the main thing is that the vast majority of parents are very happy for RSE to be taught in schools. No differences depending on the gender of the parent, and no differences depending on their age. So everyone was equally as supportive of this sort of content being covered by schools. We did look at people who identified with certain religions. So someone who ticked a box and said, I'm not religious, they were more likely to support RSE in schools. For parents saying that they were Islamic, Greek Orthodox or Baptist, or some other form of religion, like one of those more minor religious affiliations, they were the groups that were less likely to support RSE. We also asked people not just to tell us what religion they identified with. We just wanted to know how important religion was to their everyday life. And probably not surprising to anyone, those people who felt very strongly affiliated to their religion, whatever that may have been, if religion was really important to them, then they were if religion was really important to them, they were less likely to support the delivery of RSE in schools. And we also found that people who were affiliated with the Liberal National Party were less likely to support RSE. And I'll leave you to unpack that one for yourself, but probably no surprises there. So now moving on to the 40 different topics. So the vast majority of them, 32 out of the 40 topics, the level of support exceeded 95%. So there was only a small handful of topics where we had, say, between 10 to 5 or 10% of people sort of having some level of dissent and saying, no, this topic should not be covered in a school. So I'll share those ones with you now. So 15% of parents were saying, well, I don't think pleasure should be covered in a school. Abstinence, I've put an asterisk there because I actually don't think 12 or 13% of parents are saying, I don't want abstinence covered. We're thinking that these parents are actually saying we don't want an abstinence only approach, because we actually had really high levels of support for teaching children about contraception and pregnancy and STIs and different things like that. So we think that the parents ticking this box were probably more saying, I actually don't want you to do an abstinence only approach. Kind of less levels of support for gender identity, masturbation, diverse sexual orientation. Interestingly, there was also a number of parents, or a small proportion, saying we don't want you to teach about pornography, gender roles and stereotypes, or the actual reasons why people do and don't choose to engage in sexual activity. But again, really small numbers. We need to just come back to the fact that for the vast majority of the 40 topics, the level of support exceeded 95%. So now we ask them what year level these 40 different things should first be addressed by schools. And in kindergarten to year 2, there was a couple, and then a few more added in years 5 and 6. So there's no real surprises there. That's probably pretty close to what schools actually do at the current time. But what was interesting is probably everything else that comes over in the next slide. So all the other topics, they actually wanted schools to start addressing these in years 7 and 8. And typically we know a lot of schools will hold off on some of these things until at least year 9, possibly year 10. Some schools won't cover these things at all. But it was very clear that our parents were saying, we want these things taught and we actually want you to start doing it in the earlier years of secondary school, which is a little bit different to what the curriculum currently says and a little bit different to what we think is actually happening in the majority of schools. But that gives you a nice snapshot of the 40 different topics as well and how comprehensive they were. So again, we had this open-ended text box available for people if they wanted to share their thoughts about RSE in schools, and close to half of the parents from Western Australia opted to do that. And I'm going to share some of those comments. I just want to remind you that the vast majority, again, of people were really highly supportive and provided very positive commentary, or they were kind of neutral in nature. So these are some of the examples. And you can see here a really diverse mix of both males and females, different ages, different religious backgrounds, different voting preferences. And now if I flick over to the not so nice comments, I will just give a bit of a content warning that some of these may be a little bit upsetting for people to read. We've been a little bit selective in what we've chosen to share. The vast majority, again, of any negative comments, they really only focus, these parents, their real issue was about diverse gender. They didn't really seem to worry about any other issues related to RSE. It was just about, please don't teach my kids about all those different gender identities. So this is the language that they shared. And again, mix, males and females, different ages, different religions, and different voting preferences. So there was certainly no trend as to who was more likely to be a positive commenter or a negative commenter. We then asked parents to tell us how they felt about the quality of RSE that was currently being delivered in their children's schools. And most schools seem to get a ranking somewhere between the good and very good category. But what is interesting, I think, is that there's a significant number in there, so nearly 30% saying that my child has not received or to my knowledge, my child has not received RSE at their school, which is significant. And I would probably suggest that most schools are doing something. So, you know, perhaps there's quite a bit happening here that parents are not aware of. And there was a significant number in there as well who said, I just don't know enough to even answer this question. So it definitely shows that there is work for schools to do to keep their parents informed. We then asked the parents to tell us, how comfortable are you talking about RSE yourself with your child, let alone the school program? You know, how comfortable are you and how often do you actually have these kinds of conversations? And again, remember that these will be parents that have children from kindergarten all the way through to year 12. So interestingly, they seem to be very comfortable, very happy to have these conversations. You know, close to 75% were saying that very happy with the idea of speaking to their child about RSE. But we actually asked them, how often have you actually had that discussion? And the question was, how often has that discussion happened in the last year? Most people haven't, or they've done it very infrequently. So that's another interesting one. So they're very comfortable with the idea of doing it, but in reality, they're not doing it all that well or all that often. Okay, so in conclusion, just want to remind everyone again that West Australian parents are highly supportive of schools to deliver RSE. And there was no impact by gender. So even those Catholic parents, and remember there was a significant number in there. So 20% identified as Catholic themselves, and close to 20% actually had a child in the Catholic system. Those parents were just as likely as all other parents to support RSE. And the only reason I'm bringing the Catholics to the forefront is because we do have a school sector that is dedicated to Catholics. And I even know, in trying to promote the work of the RSE project and trying to give the teachers in that school sector access to our training, the Catholic Education Office is very restrictive in what they will allow their teachers, the training that they will allow their teachers to receive. And this particular project is demonstrating that parents actually want this stuff covered, and they want a really comprehensive program of topics to be covered by schools. So there's 40 topics on the table. They wanted all 40. There was only a very small handful where perhaps 5, 10, 15% were saying that's not an appropriate topic for a school. The vast majority of parents, in the vast majority of cases, wanted the full gamut. And not only that, they actually wanted schools to do this quite early. So years 7 and 8, which, as I said before, a lot of the time schools will hold off into years 9 and 10 to start covering these things. So moving forward in our advocacy work, it's just really important that we continue to educate parents about the best practice principles for the delivery of relationships and sexuality education. We can deliver all of these topics actually down in the earliest years of primary school. There are age-appropriate ways to address all of these issues. So we need to educate parents about that, in addition to our work in educating the school sector. And we just build on it in an age-appropriate way throughout every year level. It's got to be that repeated instruction. So we're basically incrementally building on lessons each and every year. Perhaps we need to do some work to have some more tailored engagement with people from particular religious affiliations. It's made it clear to us that we maybe need to look at the Islamic and the Baptist sectors a little bit more closely. Let's have some conversations with them about, what can we put on the table that would be realistic and okay for your parent groups? What topics wouldn't be acceptable? Because I think it is really important that we don't throw everything out. We try to include as much as possible that we can, acknowledging that perhaps we're not going to be able to be as comprehensive as we would like to be, but we really want these young people to get as much information as they can. We've obviously got to do a little bit more work to educate the general population around gender diversity. And that's what this other project that I'd spoken about is doing so beautifully. So nationally, they surveyed 2,000 parents. Their focus was on diverse sexualities and diverse genders. Very similar. There was less dissent about being gay and lesbian. There was definitely more dissent about people who were gender diverse. But I know that particular team of researchers is doing some work to create some beautiful videos to hopefully provide some education on why gender diversity is, not conversion. No one has a mental health issue. We just need to be supportive. And they're going to have some videos of parents who've got gender diverse children talking about what an impact it has had on their child's schooling when that school provides a safe and affirming space. So stay tuned. The RSE project will definitely share some findings of that particular work as it comes out. I think the evidence from this project's really shown that schools should be communicating and actually letting their parents know about what they're covering, because time and time again, parents have shown us that they are supportive. They just want to be informed. They want to be on the front foot. They want to know that certain things were covered in class so that they can follow it up with some at-home conversations. It's really awkward and difficult for parents to bring some of these RSE topics up sometimes. So if the school's already opened the door for them, parents love that. They love knowing that that's already happened and someone's done the awkward bits for them. And then whatever we can do to really encourage those conversations at home. And I know Tessa's probably going to speak a little bit about this sort of stuff in her presentation, but we always talk about primary school, a lot of your RSE lessons, if we can take home homework activities which encourage you to talk to the adults at home, that's a really useful tool to encourage those at-home conversations. And then I think on one last point, just that we still have some particular subpopulations that we need to understand. So we need to put more effort into understanding different religious perspectives. Maybe we want to go down the route of actually trying to understand different political affiliations a little bit better, but also our cultural and linguistically diverse groups, and even people in regional Western Australia, just having a look at all of those different subpopulations, and perhaps we need to be a little bit more targeted in the way we advocate for RSE in schools amongst certain groups. I just want to finish by acknowledging and thanking Claudia, who helped us with the instrument. So as I said, it was a Canadian instrument, but Claudia road tested it for us with a number of parents around the country and helped make some tweaks. And June is our fabulous biostatistician who held our hand, because we are a little bit of a bunch of novices when it comes to some stats. So she has assured us we've done everything correctly. So thank you very much to those two, but in particular to the West Australian Department of Health. They have been amazing in supporting the RSE project for nearly 10 years. And when I came to them with this idea that I really wanted this piece of work, they made it happen. And I think it's a data set that we're incredibly proud of and we think is really important and going to be incredibly useful to expand delivery of RSE in schools across the country and hopefully more specifically in Western Australia. So that's me done. I think I did it. Cool, good, tech is working. I think that we're going to just hand straight over, Karina, to Tessa. And then if anyone's got any questions, both Tessa and I can answer those at the end.
Thanks, Jacqui. That was excellent and resonates certainly with, I guess, a lot of my experiences in this field. My presentation's sort of less academic, whilst I'm involved in some research. Really, I guess what I'm talking about tonight is some of my own experiences, in this space, engaging parents from all different schools. And what I'll do now is share my screen before I go any further. How do we feel about this as an outcome? Are we happy with that? Karina, can you see my slides?
Yes, looks all good. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Catherine. So before I go any further, I would also like to acknowledge that I am presenting this evening, or having a conversation with you all this evening on the lands of both the Kaurna and the Paramount people. So I'm in the Adelaide Hills, and we're desperate for it to warm up here. But a similar sentiment to Jacqui, I always feel like it's important to acknowledge elders because for tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been teaching their young people about respect and love and kindness and relationships. And so anyway, hopefully we're making an impact as, I attempt to sort of do the same, with the communities who I work with as well. In Your Skin is an organisation that I established a number of years ago now. We work predominantly with schools, so it's students, it's also parents, and it's teachers, principals, and the nature of that work is very varied. We provide a lot of professional development in this space, really working with anyone who works with young people, essentially. But we also provide education to adults as well. So we work with professional athletes like AFL football teams and NRL, like the rugby teams, Cricket Australia, with Melbourne Victory have recently come on board. So we're launching into soccer, Racing SA, interesting. So also working with jockeys, unexpected. But we provide adult sexual wellbeing workshops as well, and we work with young adults in residential university colleges too. So same messages really to all of the different audiences, but just delivered in context and age appropriate ways. We provide consultancy as well, so we do a lot of evaluations of existing school-based RSE, and we look at perhaps where the gaps might be, or where where there might be some areas that could be perhaps sort of strengthened. We co-design programs with schools and their students, which is really fun. We work with schools around their policies. We run task groups, which we'll talk a bit more about as we go through. We've done some advising in terms of the national HPE curriculum leaders or the curriculum advisors, and that was certainly, I guess, in that process of reviewing the HPE curriculum before launching version 9. And we also work really closely with education departments as well, including the Western Australian Department for Education. We do also do some research, and currently we're partnering with Flinders University, and we're actually looking at how can classrooms better cater to, I guess, or how can schools or RSE programs better cater to a multicultural classroom. And so that's really interesting. And so, yeah, and that's another reason, Jacqui, why I found your research very interesting. Very quickly, just so you understand where we're coming from, because sometimes it can be a bit of a barrier for some parents, we take a super sex positive approach. And it's funny because, you know, when you say that at information evening, sometimes you might almost hear the, you know, what does that mean? You know, what are you talking to my child or young person about? And we reassure them that we're not sort of encouraging them to go out and have as much sex as humanly possible with as many different sex partners as possible. But it's simply about acknowledging that the vast majority of young people in school, in middle school, high school, senior school, whatever term you'd like to use, are likely to grow up to be independent, autonomous, sexually active adults. And there is a role that we can play as educators to support a really healthy psychosexual development in these young people. And so I think it's about breaking that down. And also, I guess it's about, you know, subtly getting these parents on board to become, you know, sex positive parents, which is kind of exciting as well. And we tend to be able to do that. All the work we do is evidence-based. I don't need to talk much about that, but of course we're very familiar with the fact that, of course, relationships and sexuality education programs should not be about any one person's morals, ethics or values. But, you know, we know there's particular information that young people need access to in order to increase their sexual health and safety or their sexual health outcomes. And so our programs are very much about increasing access to that information. And they're harm reduction focused as well. And so these are the sorts of things we talk about with parents at parent information evenings, and we discuss with schools. But, you know, we know that a harm reduction approach has worked incredibly well in the alcohol and other drug sector. Similarly, it works very well, you know, in terms of talking about sexual health with young people. No one likes to be told, don't do this and don't do that. And of course, that is an ongoing criticism of, you know, students when it comes to school-based RSE. They're sick of, I guess, that sex negativity and that risk-focused approach, and they're sort of, you know, I guess, you know, what they also say is if you keep banging on about the criminalisation of things like underage sexting, you know, and you bring the police in to talk about that and tell us how bad it is and that we're, you know, we're going to wind up on the sex offenders register. Perhaps if you took that kind of harm minimisation approach, if and when something goes wrong, which is highly likely to happen, we will be more likely to come to you and ask for help. But if you take that zero tolerance approach, we won't come to you because, you know, we're probably risking being told, you know, I told you so. So that's sort of where we're coming from. And very occasionally we get opposition from parents. But I think increasingly, you know, parents are becoming far more accepting of this. And that statistic that Jacqui just presented of 93% of parents being supportive of school-based RSE, that really rings true to me as well. And I think sometimes we get wildly swept up in a very vocal minority who might have a lot to say about it in opposition. But generally speaking, I think parents are so relieved that someone else is starting this conversation, and I think they're happier to continue it and perhaps less comfortable in initiating it. And I think that's where they tend to be, you know, really quite grateful for these programs. So with the schools we work with, we always do surveys, certainly if the school has capacity. Of course, we survey the students in terms of what are your learning needs, and where are the gaps in, I guess, current RSE. But we also like to survey the parents. And so, you know, all parents, guardians, caregivers, you know, and we sort of ask them, what do you want for your children, you know, in terms of their sexual health and safety education? I think language is really important. And I think that steering away from terms like sex ed can also just be, that can be a very simple strategy. So I think sexual health and safety for me is a far more inviting, far less confronting or controversial term. Even health education, I know there's a big push in America at the moment to just simply refer to it as health education. But, you know, asking the parents or the caregivers, you know, what are their knowledge levels and how can we support them, you know, as a school to work together to enhance the health and safety, you know, of their young people. you know, as Jacqui alluded to, what types of conversations can we be having with our children at home? We'll come to that as well. We'll ask them what information and skills they consider would be really useful for them and their children. Asking parents, I guess, what fears they might have about the program. And I think that it's really important for us to address those fears at that parent information evening and let families know how their input or feedback, you know, has been incorporated and addressed. You know, I think often, you know, as Jacqui alluded to, sometimes, you know, there is that fear that we are speaking to students about concepts that they're not developmentally ready for. And what we just often need parents to more firmly understand is that these messages are delivered in age-appropriate ways. You know, we are guided by the evidence base, and incrementally, you know, each year we strengthen that and we build on that and we take that conversation further and I guess provide hopefully a more kind of nuanced exploration of what's going on for them. So I think that the parent information evenings are really important, and we always recommend that schools hold those prior to program implementation. And I think that means parents and carers often feel as though they have been consulted, you know, or for some they've been warned, but they've had an opportunity, been provided with an opportunity to kind of express any concerns they might have. And I think at those evenings, you know, it's so incredibly important to emphasise, I guess, the full benefits of RSE beyond, I guess, just sexuality education itself. So, you know, we know so many well-designed evidence-based sexuality education programs teach skills that, you know, are much broader, you know, for many other areas of a young person's life, you know, whether it's friendships, healthy intimate relationships, self-advocacy or self-assertiveness, negotiation and refusal skills, and I guess that practice of consent more broadly. This is not just about sexual activity and keeping safe purely in that context. I think parents like to receive an overview of curriculum content, both at a parent information evening, but also I think in writing, because they might have some particular questions, which of course we would invite them to ask. And I think that, you know, when we're talking to the parents, we have to provide the context for the why of the program. And what I mean by that is, if we're speaking specifically about respect for relationships education, I think parents need to be aware that, you know, there's an alarming trend of declining sexual health outcomes amongst young people, including increasing incidents of coerced sexual activity and sexual assault, you know, which has been going on now for about 15 years. And so what we know is that an evidence-based respect for relationships education program, or, you know, relationships and sexuality education program can actually has the potential to address sexual violence or, you know, reduce sexual violence. Because if we're doing it really, really well, we're increasing our young people's capacities to refuse sexual activity, to listen to refusal, but to also, you know, navigate, negotiate consensual sexual activity if that's where they're at as well. So I often feel like even when a parent comes to an information evening, if the body language is quite tight and tense to begin with, as we go through that context and we look at what is going on for young people and we look at like the number of declining sexual health outcomes, you know, for our 16 to 24-year-olds, if we then say, you know, an answer to this is an evidence-based RSE program, and, you know, I guess talking parents through that, you can sort of see the body language start to relax and you can kind of see, right, this is not just sort of, you know, gratuitous discussions around pornography and sexual activity. There's sort of a very real and meaningful purpose. So of course, you know, it's sort of saying if we do this well, we can, you know, increase, we'll see increases in effective and consistent barrier protection use, such as external condoms. We'll see decreases in STI transmission, unplanned pregnancies, and we can go through all these health outcomes. But essentially we're saying to parents, we can also reduce rates of coerced sexual activity, sexual assault, because we're increasing our young people's, I guess, capacities to assert interpersonal skills and to really be able to practice things like consent, you know, reciprocity, mutuality, and instill in our young people this ethics of self-care and care for other. I think as well, it's about providing the evidence base for parental support for the program. So letting parents know that actually parenting style is the most important mitigating factor in terms of negative media influence on young people's psychosexual development, including online pornography. So letting them know that actually they're the most important people in these conversations, not the school, the parents are. And they have such huge capacity to increase their own young people's sexual health and safety. I've worked with a number of schools where we've invited parents to actually sit on task group, respectful relationships, education committees, whatever you might like to call it. And those groups look at perhaps school induction processes, student handbooks, internal processes for responding to incidents of sexual misconduct. It might be about looking at external organisations that can come in and complement the school's existing RSE program. But often parents, I think, enjoy an opportunity to, I guess, participate, and they might only participate for a 6 or 12-month period, and other parents can then kind of come on board. But that's really wonderful because they can see what's going on behind the scenes. And, you know, if they're quite vocal, quite influential parents, it can have a really positive impact on the broader kind of parent body. And of course, I think it's about providing, you know, legal, government and other supporting guidelines. And we'll get to that in one moment. If I can remember how to go to the next slide. Geez, that was tough. So, you know, what do I mean by supporting documentation? We're talking about things, particularly as Jacqui said, you mentioned there might be increasing, you know, what's the word that you've used, Jacqui? I can't remember if you said, or there's less dissent around sexual diversity perhaps these days, not so much in the case of gender diversity, but, you know, that the anti-discrimination legislation I think is incredibly important. Government guidelines. So, for example, in South Australia, the South Australian Department for Education has a supporting gender diverse, intersex and sexually diverse children and young people policy. Instruction from governing bodies and protection authorities. So whether that might be, you know, documentation from the Commissioner for Children and Young People, whether it might be the Catholic Education Office, Anglican Schools Australia, whatever it might be, but showing them that, you know, there are authorities behind us who you know, we align in terms of our approach to these issues. Q&As or fact sheets, information sheets for the parents. I think they do like to sort of see, as I said before, the content of the program, the expected health and or attitudinal outcomes for, you know, implementing that program at school. But also too, I think on those, you know, the Q&A sheets or fact sheets, I think it's really important as well, you know, just highlighting in a couple of sentences the evidence base for the program. Of course, there are so many additional resources, and you're probably, you know, telling you all how to suck eggs here, but we provide links and we discuss all the various sort of guides that are out there. You know, we haven't bothered to reinvent the wheel because there are just so many fabulous resources already, and I think, you know, often it's one of the most common questions we get, you know, where can I get further reading? Can we please have references or the links to the you know, reports like, for example, La Trobe University, the National Secondary School Students and Sexual Health Surveys, you know, so they're, you know, I find parents are often really thirsty for additional reading, which I think is a really wonderful thing. Sometimes I even get parents coming up to me afterwards and saying, that was really enlightening about online pornography, and can you recommend a porn subscription for my child so they can get a really realistic, you know, idea about sexual activity and whatever else. And I'm like, I think if I do that, the school probably won't re-employ me. But anyway, there's a whole bunch, and I'm happy to send these out in links. I'm sure your school already has their own documents, supporting documentation, evidence-based papers, research papers that they send out. But yeah, I feel like parents feel very comforted to know that there's sort of more reading they can do. And, you know, there's links to all of the ones I've just shown you on the In Your Skin website, but I'm happy to kind of send that out in addition. So, I mean, what's our framework for these sort of what can perceivably be difficult conversations for some parents? You know, I think there's some excellent advice from UNESCO, but essentially one of their guiding principles is, you know, to what extent are the aims of and the objectives of a school-based program compatible with the hopes of parents for the health and safety of their children? And of course, they align beautifully. They're actually not in conflict at all. You know, there's no parent I've ever come across who says, no, actually, you know, if this program is going to make my child healthier and safer, no, actually, no, I don't want it implemented. So I think when they truly understand the evidence base, you know, and the content and the context in which it's delivered, you know, I think we've got a better crack at sort of gently getting them on board. Another approach we tend to use is talking about taking a public health approach to sexual violence prevention. So, you know, when we talk about public health, we're talking about the efforts that, you know, we make as a society, but, you know, even including our own kind of on our own patch of turf in a particular school, you know, the efforts that we're making to increase the health of our student population. And of course, there's a beautiful public health framework that exists already, and it's about, number one, defining the problem, or what's the problem. We're talking about sexual violence, amongst students or young people. Perhaps we're talking about harmful sexual behaviour as well. Then we measure that problem. All of that work's been done for us. We know prevalence rates, we know trends, we know what's going on. It's about identifying risk factors, and of course, all of that work's been done for us as well. Whether we're talking about hypermasculinity, peer pressure for sexual activity, peer approval of forced sex, whether we're talking about rape myth acceptance, victim blaming attitudes, exposure to online pornography, all of that work's been done. So we know what many of those risk factors are for sexual violence perpetration. The next step, in that public health approach is about designing and implementing an effective strategy. So what's that? It's an evidence-based, RSE program or respect for relationships education program. Again, all of that work's been done for us. And so the only thing that really is left for us to do is implement that strategy or that program in our schools, and where possible, undertake, an impact evaluation. And that's about assessing changes in student knowledge and attitudes, and perhaps even behavioural intentions. But I think sometimes behavioural intentions can be a funny one, because I think, we know there's a very low correlation or weak correlation between behavioural intentions and actual behaviour, but it is really, really, really nice to at least compare post-program attitudes and knowledge to pre-program attitudes and knowledge, because that just works to further sell your program to parents. Here were some of the thoughts of the students prior to our program. Here's where they're sitting post, and wow, school's becoming honestly a safer kind of place for everybody across many contexts of sexual health. I think it's about that rights-based approach as well. So, young people have the basic human rights, which include access to sound education, including health education, but also access to sound quality healthcare. And I guess these programs, in my opinion, should not just be about increasing sexuality knowledge, they should be about increasing sexual health literacy. So we should be increasing young people's likelihoods to actually access sexual health services, and these programs should be the conduit between them. So, it is about letting young people know what referral services are out there for them. And I think parents need to know this as well. And I think parents need to understand that sometimes young people are going to want to access a service without, the consent or knowledge of their parents. And that that's something we should never, I guess, put any barriers against, because we want to, we want our young people to be proactive about their health, to be proactive about their learning. But we want more young people to actually be accessing healthcare generally, but sexual healthcare specifically, because they're so underrepresented in the sexual healthcare sector. I think as well, a nice conversation with parents is that one around the fact that, our relationships and sexuality education program is simply an extension of, or a complementary component to, the existing child protection curriculum that the school is already implementing. It's exactly the same principles. There's just perhaps a stronger focus in our RSE program on same or similar age peers, rather than perhaps, adult perpetrators or predators. But it's the same principles in terms of, consent and bodily autonomy, etc., etc., etc. So what are a couple of other tips before I wrap up? I'll just have a sip of water. I've been told by so many people that I'm the quickest speaker in the South, so I hope you've all been able to understand what I've been talking about, but please ask any questions if I have been speaking too quickly. For some schools, they've kind of employed this strategy of actually having just one or two designated people who do work really closely with families, particularly families who have concerns. And I think that's quite a nice approach if staff are really time poor and they're not across the evidence base and they're not necessarily across the content of the program. And I think, this designated person or this couple or few designated people, they're really familiar as, with reports, resources for parents. There's, they have a couple of, standard email responses which they can tailor when they're contacted by parents. So I think that's sometimes nice, because it can be very stressful for staff members, as many of you know, for many teachers who might get bombarded perhaps with these concerns and not feel adequately prepared to address those. in a way that does justice to the program and in a way that I guess, you know, allays some of those fears of the parents. As Jacqui already said, I think it's about incorporating assignments that engage the parents as well. So it might be that there are assignments that students are given where they have to go home and talk to mum and dad or mum and dad or whoever their caregivers or parents are. You know, they've got to ask them about X, Y, and Z, or they've got to perhaps do an assignment together. But also too, sort of giving parents assignments as well. It can be something really simple as make sure, you know that there's an external provider coming in to the school perhaps the following day. That bit of homework for the parents is making sure that, you know, over the dinner table perhaps, or driving home from school, that question is, how did that session go today? What did your friends think of it? Was it relevant? Was it interesting? Did it miss the mark? Why did it miss the mark? So, you know, they're not particularly daunting tasks, but they're sort of some easy ways to kind of, you know, start generating that dialogue. And, you know, of course, I think my biggest tip from my own personal experience, or professional experience, I should say, is about keeping it health and safety focused, and certainly keeping the language that way. I think it's really difficult to argue with any program that is categorically about increasing health and safety. And yes, we're talking about sexual health and safety, but it's health and safety nonetheless. And I feel like that makes things a bit more tricky to argue with. So plenty of resources I'm happy to send people, but I might end it there if that's okay. Karina, is that okay with you? And I'll just, yeah, I'll hand back over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tess, and thank you so much, Jacqui. We do have some time for questions, so please feel free to drop some questions in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and show your video, you can use the reaction buttons at the bottom. There's a raise hand, and when I see that you've raised your hand, I can hand the mic over to you. So I will start us off because we have had some questions come through to us, and the first one is for Tessa, and if you have any tips for parents to help if you have any tips for schools to help attract large numbers of parents to information sessions, as often these events are not well attended.
You're on mute, Tessa. Sure, it was gold.
And you know what? I've forgotten. No, I can't believe I still do that. Some of the most successful parent information sessions I have been to have been ones where they've actually had a panel of speakers. So there might be 2 or 3 of us, and there might be someone talking about alcohol and drugs. There might be someone talking about vaping. There might be someone talking about sexuality education or resilience. And we tend to get parents in droves when there's a bit of a collective or panel.
Okay, fantastic. Do you have anything that you could speak to about that, Jacqui, as well?
I'd agree. I think so if the school is not known for putting on parent information evenings, suddenly to throw one in the mix and it's all about sex is just not going to attract people. So if it's I know the schools that I've been involved in, if they've got like a recurring calendar of events, then that works. But yeah, I totally agree. If we can attach ourselves to the mental health and the alcohol and drug stuff, that's a great way to get our foot in the door sometimes.
Less orthodox response is that some schools have got a huge amount of parents when they've actually put on nibbles and alcohol.
Yep.
Great, thank you. I have another question about fact sheets. I believe, Tess, you spoke a bit about fact sheets and whether they would be fact sheets for teachers or, sorry, not teachers, parents. Like, do you think they need to be targeted, or have you seen any good examples of fact sheets?
Yeah, so we often provide schools with a template, and it's essentially sort of saying, what's the evidence base for this program? I guess the more tailored part is, what does our program look like? And, you know, here are some of the expected, you know, attitudinal, you know, and or knowledge-based changes that we expect to see in our student population. And it's about creating, I guess, a safer culture at school. You know, I guess the school also making a statement that they're sort of aiming towards more expansive practice if they're not doing that already. And that fact sheet sort of being, you know, here are some, I guess, seminal texts that we you know, you can read if you are interested in understanding more about comprehensive sexuality education. So yeah, I think that's nice because they feel more informed and consulted. And I think, you know, as we all know, the more we know about something, the less fearful we tend to be of it.
Fantastic, thank you. And can you or either of you speak to, you'd spoken about assignments that could be taken home for parents. Are there any more examples that you can share with us?
I'm going to hand that to you, Jacqui. My children are
I think you did a beautiful list. So anything that really prompts an at-home conversation. And, you know, I would much prefer to work on a homework project talking about puberty than, I don't know, some of the other rubbish that my kids bring home. But honestly, it's anything where go home and interview a parent, or at least show your health workbook and what activities that you've been doing. Talk, you know, you have to go and talk about the video that we showed in class today. I think another really useful way to introduce RSE outside of the health space is in English a lot of the time. And I know my kids in primary school have had to do oral presentations on a whole bunch of different topics, and some of them are really boring. So I don't know, spice it up a little bit, get them to investigate stuff. That's also then reinforcing some health lessons.
I think as well, some images, you know, whether, you know, sending the student home with some images and sort of seeing what the parents or the caregivers perceive, you know, what does that image say to the parent or the caregiver, and what does it speak or say to the young person, and what's with those differences? You know, is it generational? Is it, you know, that they perhaps get their information from very different primary sources, be it social media perhaps, or yeah, images tend to be a great one. And we used one a few years ago, and it was the women's football. And Erin Phillips had won whatever the equivalent of the McGarry medal is. I don't follow any footy. But the photo was on the front page of the Advertiser, and it was Erin Phillips and her wife. And her wife just gave her a congratulatory kiss. You know, she'd been awarded this medal, and they were both wearing strapless dresses. And so it looked like there were these two naked women kissing, you know, on the front page of the Advertiser. And it went from what should have been this moment of celebration and honour to sexualisation of a lesbian couple. And so, you know, if we can kind of find images like that, maybe that's too much for some families, but I do think images are a really great way to get parents and children talking.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have in the chat. If anyone online wants to raise their hand, ask a question, or just say hello and connect with Tess and Jacqui, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
I was just going to jump in, Tessa. It made me laugh when you said that one of the most common questions you get when you do your parent presentation is, can you tell me a decent porn site? Because that's exactly the question I got last night when I did a parent presentation. And I have come up with a website. I've found a couple that I quite like, but I am very clear. This is not for under 18s. You should not be sharing this with under 18s. However, if you want to make it available to your child, and then I would pick one or two that I quite like.
Yeah, I'm like, wow, that's some seriously sex positive parenting.
Yeah, and it throws me because I have had it a few times, and I'm like, oh, I really want to support you, but I don't know how. But I do know that Professor Alan McKee, who's based in Sydney, that's one of the projects he's working on at the moment. So he's had a whole team of about 15, 20 different experts, and some of them are researchers and some of them are educators and some of them are actual porn producers. Were you part of it as well? So yeah. He got us to look at a few different platforms, and we all got to vote and decide on, you know, what would be an appropriate sort of visual education for, you know, perhaps that 16 to 25 year market. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing the final results of that, because I definitely think that is like, we know we've got to deliver this education in schools, but we've just, and at a community level, we've got to give people information as well. And unfortunately, pornography is the default.
We've got a hand raised from Catherine. Please feel free to take the stage.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for your presentation, Tessa and Jacqui. It's brilliant, fantastic. I just wanted to know whether there's ever been any thought about some sort of adjunctive parent sessions, not information sessions, but sessions for them to have a look at their own relationships in life and where they're at, and how does consent sit in their own relationships, and how confident are they to talk about sex with their or their own relationship with their partners. And just I guess I'm just thinking about encouraging parents to see that this isn't just about education for young people and children. This is a lifelong education. And where are you at in your own education for yourself and your partner, and how often do you prioritise these conversations for each other? I just think that as a society, this thought about respectful sexual health education stops in year 12, and we've done it all. Then we know what we need to know, and there's not this expectation that this is lifelong learning and discussion and conversations that should be continuing in the household, and just increasing that visibility across the board around having these conversations. So I just wondered if that ever sort of happens. Thank you.
Would you like to go first, Jacqui? Or
Well, okay, I will. I need to say that you bring up an excellent point, and anyone who is sort of formally trained in sexuality education will know and will have been taught from the first day that before you can be an effective educator of others, you've got to work through your own stuff first. And so we call it in the biz a sexual attitudes reassessment. So it's quite a structured process of actually being exposed to lots of different things and seeing how you react to them, seeing how other people in your workshop react to them, because that's all a learning activity, but also then just working through your own personal history to really understand how that is going to influence your interactions and your facilitation with other people as a sexuality educator. But yeah, it's not something that is sort of routinely available to the general public. You know, you might have groups like Relationships Australia do some sort of small little ad hoc things in that space. But yeah, no, that real structural process of examining your own sexual attitudes and your own sexual histories, I don't know of anything that's really available for the general public. And only just to add that I completely agree. I think we've got to move this on. This is lifelong learning. There will be things that related to your sexuality that, you know, you, in your 40s when you're going through childbirth or something like that, we're going to need a refresh in certain things if we're entering perimenopause and menopause. Moving into aged care, you know, there's always things that we can learn, and we can't expect it to just be covered in a couple of health lessons in high school.
yeah, I second all that, Catherine. That's such a great question, and that's why in our parent information evenings we do a lot of talking about for people of any age. You know, for example, the more gender equitable their attitudes, the more likely they are to have really respect for relationships, including where both people report high relationship satisfaction, it's mutually consenting, it's mutually pleasurable. So we talk a lot about the fact that this is not just for our students now, but it's and our young people now, but it's into the future. So, you know, it's that positive sexuality framework. It's about, you know, if our young people are interested in becoming sexually active, or indeed if they're sexually active already, how can we make sure that they're consciously, I guess, cultivating a sexuality that, you know, if and when they want to, one day they can share really well with someone and the other person's sharing theirs really well with them. So a lot of our principles apply to everybody. And I tend to finish our parent information evenings with this beautiful Cindy Gallop quote. And it's not like this well-known quote, because she's amazing and she just said it off the cuff in an interview once. And luckily it was on YouTube, so I could press pause and scribe and play and pause and scribe. But she sort of says, look, many of us are born into environments and families where our parents bring us up to have good manners, a work ethic, a sense of responsibility, accountability, but no one ever brings us up to behave well in bed. And they should, because kindness and compassion and empathy and generosity and consideration and care are just as important there as they are in any other context of our lives where we're actively taught to exercise those values. And so we try to kind of thread all of that stuff through. I guess to more directly answer your question, I'm aware, like a number of European countries, obviously the more progressive ones, when they're doing whole school approach and they're doing best practice, they've got the students doing their sessions. Of course, best practice is not having the parents and young people together, because everyone hates that and reports feeling awkward. But they run the same program for the parents, but it's not about the parental context and their current comfort, you know, with their own sexuality and how they go about, or the lens through which they view matters of sexuality. It's more about the parents are being delivered the content that the students were delivered that week, if that makes sense. And that's all I've heard of that gets as close to what you're talking about as possible. It might exist, but I've not come across it.
I mean, we also have a unit at university. We've got like some postgraduate stuff, but at Curtin, if you've got a elective or an optional unit available in your course, doesn't matter what you're studying, you could be doing business, chemistry, anything, you can come and do the sexology unit. So it gets a bit of a reputation. And everyone's like, oh, you know, if you've got something spare, come and do that unit. And they will say they're obviously in their early 20s and they're like, this is the sex ed I never got at school. It's like because we can also go to that next level and be a little bit more detailed. And they just soak it up. But yeah, not easily accessible, not mainstream.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, I just saw your message in the chat there, Claire, and I'm very happy to connect. I'm very interested to read your thesis when it's done.
If we don't have any more questions, we can wrap it up. Thank you so much, Tess and Jacqui, for your presentations today. I will be sending out some more information about both Tess and Jacqui's work. The report that Jacqui referred to, it's almost finished and that will be shared once available. I've also got a really short evaluation survey. I'll just pop the link in the chat and really appreciate if you could just give that a go. It just helps us with determining what topics we can present on in our after school workshops. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you again next time.
Thank you very much, Karina.
Thanks, Karina.
And Tess and Jacqui, if you could stay on the line, that would be fab. Thank you.